Hello, and welcome to this Alliance webinar on philanthropy and the common good. My name is Elaine Stabler. I'm the magazine editor for Alliance, and I will be moderating today's discussion. In June this year, Alliance magazine published a special feature on philanthropy and the common good. Today, our panel includes one of our guest editors, and one contributor. Hopefully a second one will be joining us in a minute. But they comprise Bruce Stevens from the Haas Centre of Public Service and Alliance guest editor, Dorothy Chan, head of Philanthropy Service and Advisory for HSBC, and hopefully Hafsat Abiola, President of Women in Africa, will be joining us shortly. Before we get to the discussion, a few words on housekeeping. We'll run for an hour. Each of the panelists will make a short presentation, followed by a question and answer session, which you, our audience, will have the chance to take part in. It's important to note that this webinar includes two chat functions. The first looks like a little speech bubble, and you can find it in the bottom right hand of your screen. You can use this chat to introduce yourself. Please do if you wish. And you can also let us know if you're having any issues with your audio. My colleague is on hand behind the scenes to help you if you need it. The second chat is called Slido, and it's used for the question and answer part of this webinar. You'll also find it in the bottom right hand of your screen. You can submit a question to our panelists at any time using Slido. I'll be keeping an eye on the Slido throughout the webinar and selecting questions to put to the panelists during the Q&A. When you ask a question, it'd be wonderful. Please tell us who you are and where you're from. We're limited by time, but we'll put as many of them as we can to our panel. And should you wish to activate closed captioning, you can do so via the CC button in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Captioning is available in English and several other languages. And lastly, I'm delighted to let you know that today we're offering a 20% discount code to anyone who would like to order a print copy of Alliance magazine, Philanthropy and the Common Good. Alliance magazine is a compendium of information, analysis, and opinion on global philanthropy and social investment. The link is in the chat if you would like to do so. So, without further delay, let's jump into today's session. The atomization of society, an economy based on competition and growing distrust of politics and of institutions in general, these are some of the factors that have led to a diminished commitment to the common good. But what is the common good? Broadly, it's anything that benefits and is shared by all members of a given community. Therefore, pursuit of the common good should be necessary in producing a more egalitarian society and a habitable planet. But the devil is in the detail. There is more disagreement than agreement about what comprises the common good. Is it any more than an abstraction? Who defines it? Whose responsibility is it to secure it? And particularly for today's discussion, what role does philanthropy have in reviving the notion of the common good, especially where philanthropy itself is one of the institutions facing scepticism? In fact, can philanthropy's commitment to this issue help to restore its legitimacy and the necessary behaviour to become a societal norm for the future? These are among the questions we will explore in this webinar. And I'm delighted to see that Hafsat has joined us. Welcome, Hafsat. I'm going to begin the introductions, so you are just in time. But on to our panelists first. Bruce, I'm going to come to you. Bruce Stevens has spent most of his professional career either practicing, studying, or teaching philanthropy. He holds a PhD in political theory from Stanford University, where he taught for 20 years after retiring as CEO of the Walter Elise Haas Fund, which is a family foundation in San Francisco. He likens his work in philanthropy to a job he has had in his early days parachuting in to fight forest fires, which is more at stake but slightly less risky. Bruce, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say it's an honor to be part of this panel with Hafsat and Dorothy. It's exciting to be part of a worldwide discussion on what I think is such an important topic of the common good. The common good, in quotes, seems like a fairly straightforward aspirational topic, like freedom or solidarity or human rights and so forth. But like those terms, the only when translated into the complicated so-called thick and thin of the local venues of terms, does the multiplicity of meanings emerge. Meaning that Michael Walzer, who's a well-known, has been lifelong a well-known political theorist, taught earlier at Harvard and Princeton, and has been a lifelong editor of Dissent magazine. He wrote a little book not long ago with the title of Thick and Thin, and I think it's a wonderful way of describing terms like common good, which in a more general aspirational way seem to be fairly straightforward, but it's only when they become translated into the local context of use that these kind of terms, and I include common good among those, reveal the complexity that they actually contain. The first question that arises with a term like common good is the actual definitional question, and that is challenging in terms of again meaning a kind of broad term that is the kind of term that Walzer would describe as thin. In other words, when you first describe something like the common good, everyone kind of nods in agreement that it's a straightforward, understandable term, but it's only when you start translating it into its local venue of action and discussion that it reveals its complexity. So I want to actually discuss it briefly. One could go on and on about the definitional issues, but I just take it in terms of three contexts. One is considering the common good as a moral term. Second is considering it as a kind of logical term. And third, as a matter of justice, which sort of combines the moral and the logical. And I'll say a bit about those in just a second. First of all, in its moral context, common good is part of a framework of understanding the world that comes from ancient roots. So one can describe it as, excuse me, as coming out of an ancient concept of the idea of the state, the idea of a larger vision of moral action in the world, and the world is interpreted in a moral way. One could also describe it in anciently in religious terms the same way, that is, as part of a moral construction of the world, a moral construction of understanding life and what goes on in the world. On another level, one can describe the common good question as one of logic, that is, the old idea of maximizing interests of various sorts in the world. So it has been described by a number of authors as one is Mantur Olson, who wrote a book called The Logic of Collective Action, which has to do with logic that operates in a broader collective context, not just an individual context. it's also behind this notion that many of you may have heard of called the tragedy of the commons, which is about the pursuit of individual interests at the expense of, or sometimes oblivious to, larger collective interests. And that was a notion that Garrett Hardin was an anthropologist introduced. There's also fascinating notions of, well, behind the idea of the tragedy of the commons is the notion that one of the illustrations is you take a plot of land that is shared in common and have individuals tending individual animals on their section of the land. What happens, of course, is somebody comes along and says, "Gee, I can produce twice as much income for myself by adding one more animal to the land," and it has a minor effect on the total because it's just one animal. But what happens, of course, is that the others who are sharing the land look at that and say, "Well, I could do that too." And what finally happens in the absence of some other form of control or regulation is the destruction of the commons, because everyone adds another animal, and eventually the commons is destroyed. And I say without other forms of regulation, there are other alternatives. One is governmental regulation for a situation like that. Another one is the free market, where the free market would be, or so-called free market would allocate the land according to sort of market principles. And that has its own problems, as we know today, and worldwide we can see the problem of the operation of capitalism and the aggregation of property and the use of whatever land or whatever activities are going on in that particular piece of property ends up being in the hands of a few people that gain control over the larger resources. One of the terms I think that is can be applied to that situation or describing that situation is the one by, there's an economist, Todd Sandler, who wrote an interesting book dealing with the same subject. And his term for describing what goes on there is that individual rationality is not sufficient for collective rationality. In other words, the forces that drive individual reasoning about the use of land or whatever resources do not operate under the same conditions as collective rationality. Another long discussion, but I think an interesting way to phrase it. And then finally, a recent author who has described some of this condition sociologically is Robert Putnam, who wrote a famous book, famous in the US at least, called Bowling Alone, which had to do with the loss of a sense of community and communal responsibility for resources to a sense of more individualized, atomized society. So all of those terms, I think, fit under this general rubric of kind of a logic of the use of resources in either a constrained or unconstrained manner. And then finally, the third category I just used to describe the question of the common good and the use of common resources is a category of justice or equality. In other words, I don't know if any of you had seen the issue of Alliance that addresses this general topic. An example I use there is a kind of thought experiment about the creation of a Bureau of Weather Control, which I think actually used to be a fantasy, but it's probably not that far off. But then all kinds of questions arise if you had such a bureau in any country. That is, who would control it? What are the principles of allocation? If we were able to gain control over climate and so on, how would that be done, and who would be doing it? So those kind of questions arise as a whole separate sphere of questions that arise under the concept of the common good. So, as a typical kind of philosopher's trick, I would suggest these are the fundamental issues that arise in this kind of discussion, but that doesn't offer any particular solution. And yet, at the same time, I believe that we should be discussing these sort of fundamental questions that arise in each aspect of talking about the issue in their own sphere, and that would be one way to proceed toward trying to find solutions, or at least broader forms of deliberation about these topics that are so crucial to the future of, of, of social action and philanthropy. I will say there are questions that arise about if one were to take an approach toward discussing and resolving some of these issues, who should take the lead? And an argument could be made for any sector to sort of step up to that task. Government would be a sort of natural one. The marketplace would be another one, each with their own set of issues. But I would suggest, actually, in this case, civil society, and especially with philanthropy having resources, expending them to some degree on addressing these fundamental issues that lie behind so many of the dramatic issues of our time. Some of you may want to refer to also a sort of sub-study that came within this project of the combination of work between Alliance and the group describing themselves as the Pursuit of the Common Good group. And that is that in addressing these topics, philanthropy could have a significant role. Certainly not an exclusive one, but one that could be very helpful in terms of dedicating resources to, in a way that other sectors are not necessarily inclined to do, to these longer range, fundamental, profound issues that lie behind the question of how one pursues and tries to solve the normative and practical issues of pursuing the common good. And with that, I'll turn it over to our next presenter here. And I also want to thank Judith Simons, who has been a sort of co-conspirator with me and some others in moving this agenda forward as much as possible. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from Hafstad and Dorothy.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for that very comprehensive presentation as well. Judith was also one of our guest editors on the Alliance magazine Pursuing the Common Good special feature. Before we move on to Hafsat, I just wanted to come back to you, Bruce, on that idea of your lead article, which is the Bureau of World Weather Control.
Yeah.
Do you think the common good can be generalized across countries and continents? And if so, what would you see as its main elements?
Well, I do think so, but although very challenging because you complicate the issue itself in its own dimensions with the challenge of international translation, understanding, cultural differences, and how one can come to sort of some kind of agreement of some sort on how to address these questions, how to describe them. So I would say it is possible to think about it in an international context, but it certainly adds all the dimensions that come along with international differences and conflicts and different understandings of the world.
Mm.
So I guess I would say yes, but it is possible.
Yes, but okay. Well, I think that leads us quite nicely into my introduction for Hafsa. Hafsa is a committed humanist. She is president of Women in Africa Initiative, co-founder of Connected Women Leaders, and the co-lead for Project Dandelion, 3 platforms organizing women on the African continent and around the world into a force for sustainable development. She's an economist educated at Harvard, pro-democracy activist who lost both parents to her country's democracy struggle, and a former member of her state cabinets in charge of the UN's Millennium Development Goals and trade and investment portfolios. I could go on because there is a lot to say, but Hafsat, please take the floor. Hafsat, I think you're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
First, let me apologize. Somehow I thought I was actually signing in early for the 30-minute test, and somehow I'm late. I don't know. I kind of got the times mixed up. So my
It's no problem.
I'm so excited to be involved in this conversation because, as I shared in the interview that I had with Judith and Julie, I come from a family that identifies as philanthropists because my father was considered like one of the biggest philanthropists in Africa. So we've always felt that this sense of love for humanity. And the conversation that I had with Judith and Julie just took me back to my childhood. And so what I wanted to just summarize what we shared in that article, I think that's what I'm to do, Elaine.
Yes, by all means, please.
So I was talking about my father when he decided to run for president of my country, and I was talking to him about this. He wasn't a politician, he was a businessman and a philanthropist. And I was asking him why he wanted to run for office. And he said he felt that with his philanthropy, he was pouring water into a basket full of holes, and the water was just leaking out. And so essentially he was saying that he felt that he was not able to make much of an impact in our country, even with the tens of millions of dollars that he was putting into universities, into high schools, into different philanthropic commitments, that it wasn't really having an impact in the country. And so in the interview, I said, that since that time I've been thinking about commonwealth, as a vessel that you pour in, and the higher the whatever you're pouring in rises, the higher is the commonwealth of the society. And exactly as Professor Bruce was saying, exactly as you were saying about the collective action problem, right? That if you have individuals, the tragedy of the commons, if you have one individual put a hole in a vessel that is without holes, it may not actually make much of a difference, especially if it's not a particularly big hole. You know, the vessel can continue to accumulate wealth that can be for the benefit of everyone. And even in spite of the fact that it's a compromised vessel, because the compromise is so small, it's just one element. But the more holes are punched into the vessel, the more it becomes compromised. And the sooner it becomes like the basket that my father described that propelled him into seeking political office. And so I've been thinking, when I look at philanthropy in across the continent of Africa, I'm just mindful of the fact that the challenges seem so much. Now, there was a study that was done by People Norris, which I was privileged to hear as part of a group invited by UN Women to listen to. Essentially, we were looking at the results of Beijing, the Beijing Platform for Action, when the whole world gathered in China to look at women's rights. And then we're looking at Beijing plus 25. So 25 years after Beijing, what has been the impact? And essentially what People Norris's research found was that on the African continent, we can't really say that there's been much impact for women's rights. That women's rights in so many respects seem to be at a standstill or even be moving in reverse. And so I started thinking that if we want progress in Africa, we're going to have more sustainable, like internal momentum to get progress. We have to be able to ignite one of the organizations that I'm on the board of, World Connect, likes to say they like to turn on the power within. You would have to turn on the power within African communities to be able to generate the momentum for sustainable development. And if we look at philanthropy in general across Africa, sometimes it feels as if we bring experts from outside to who have the answers to turn on the light. But you turning on your light is not going to help people in Africa. We have to support Africans to ignite their own power within. And I think this is one of the big challenges of philanthropy. In fact, and then another big challenge is that just in its scale, the philanthropy that actually gets to Africa is so small, a fraction of total philanthropy. And when you think that Africa is 1.4 billion people, and the challenges that we have are so daunting, you know, because it's the part of the world with the largest population of people in extreme poverty, all the challenges that we all know. Then when you think that a fraction of the amount, it's pretty clear that a fraction of the amount is not going to solve the problem. So I think that if we want to actually move the African continent forward, the way in which we engage with Africa needs to change, and we need to begin to work more on community-led development, more on locally driven development, more focused on empowering women, and also considering also the fact that if we take the amount of money from aid, from philanthropy that goes into Africa, or even from the diaspora in terms of remittances that goes into Africa, it's actually a fraction of the amount of wealth Africa generates from trade. And yet African trade in terms of the global trade is less than 4%. So I think that the biggest lever that philanthropy can actually make for Africa is to help to ignite Africa's ability to trade more, so that, because trade is the biggest wealth generator for the continent. And for that, so it's not really about building schools as much as it's about helping set up vocational training centers or strengthening entrepreneurs who can then build the economy, whose taxes can then be used to fund the schools and the health centers and things like that. That's a more sustainable road to development. So these are just my initial thoughts. I don't know how it fits in with the framework that Professor Bruce shared with us in the beginning. But I do think that for Africa, given that, there was a study that was done by Soros Foundation, and it was looking at whether the world powers Africa or whether Africa powers the world. So it looked at all the money that goes into the African continent through philanthropy, through government aid of the G7, G20, what have you, through remittances, and the money that comes out of Africa. And it found that Africa actually powers the world to the tune of $50 billion a year. And when it looked at the breakdown of that money, it found that the corrupt African leaders that everyone always talks about when they talk about misgovernance on the continent accounted for about 4% of that. And then the criminal underworld, trafficking drugs, trafficking arms, and trafficking people account for about 20-something%. The bulk of it were multinational corporations and the illicit financial flows, which is just their ability to not pay taxes in Africa. So I think for me, the issue really is justice. The issue is equality. And I think that it creates this kind of injustice, which is a global economic system that has been affecting Africa for, I would say, centuries, creates basket full of holes that will be impossible for us to build the commonwealth of the African continent so long as it persists. So if philanthropy is really supposed to play a positive role, it should help us look at that critically and see how to change it, transform it for the better. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hafsat. That was wonderful. A great introduction to our conversation today, and we're definitely going to unpick it in the Q&A a bit later on. Just quickly before I go on to Dorothy, I wanted to just ask you about a couple of the things that you raised in your presentation. The common good is often seen as a Western construct, and I wanted you to elaborate on how it is conceived in African societies. And do you believe it's necessary for those societies to return to a sort of pre-colonial sense of solidarity for that view to be fully realized?
So, Elaine, I think the very wonderful reality is that Africans have not moved that far from this understanding. What is this understanding? The South Africans call it Ubuntu, which is, I am a human being through my relationship with other people. The Kenyans in East Africa, not just Kenyans, all the Swahili-speaking people, they talk about Arambe, which is coming together to do things. My favorite African quote that I use in Women in Africa to remind our women entrepreneurs, we have like 200,000 members across the African continent in every country. And I'm always saying to them to remember this quote, which is, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. We know this thing. Every African, when they, my mom had me, I was 11, she had me 11 months after she had our first child, my older brother. 10 months after me, she had my younger brother. We are like 7. So both my parents were killed in the democratic movement for Nigeria. And the youngest at the time she was killed was 7 years old, Muhammadu Hadi. As soon as they killed our mom, we contacted the US ambassador in Nigeria, who is now dead, Ambassador Walter Carrington, a real hero. Because I was finishing at Harvard University, and we asked him to send Muhammadu Hadi and Abdul Mumuni. Abdul Mumuni was 9 years old. So there was a 7 and 9-year-old, were the last 2 of the children my mom had, to send them to us in America. And then Kafila, who was at Swarthmore, my sister, who is the one after the boy that was immediately after me, left Swarthmore for 2 years. I finished at Harvard. I got a job. We got a townhouse, and we created a home and started looking after the younger ones. But it's so deeply ingrained in the way we think. The other day, I was walking on the street with my closest friend here in Brussels, Mariama. She's from Guinea-Conakry. We saw a young girl from Brazil. And we just got talking to her because she was dressed like an artist and we liked it. So we were talking to her. Turns out she had friends in Ghent, but she had nowhere to stay in Brussels. Well, she stayed at Mariama's house that evening. We didn't know her from anywhere, but the training in Africa is like that. When I was talking to Mariama today, because we're planning her birthday, which is tomorrow, she then was telling me that our older brother, who is 50 years old, has 6 children, and his job in Dakar is paying him $50 a month. And right away, we started thinking, what can we do? What can we do to help him? It is so ingrained in the African culture that we must be there for one another. But here's what I will tell you, Elaine. In most of the African economies, 10% of the population are in formal employment, have jobs that pay well. The problem is not that we've lost our sense of community. That we cannot lose. It is more part of us than the black skin that people think of when they think of us. Our communal orientation is really what makes us African. But the problem is that the African economies, as they have been designed, are not giving us enough of a commonwealth that we can share. So there's so much pressure on the people that have formal employment. If you look at the data of people that are well-to-do in my country, Nigeria, you start to see that a lot of people in formal employment also have high blood pressure, stress, because they're dealing with so many demands. These are demands that we want to meet, but the way the economies are structured makes it difficult to meet them.
Right. Thank you, Hafsat. That was great, a great answer to the question. And we are definitely going to come back to talk about economies and democracy in relation to the common good. I want to move on to Dorothy. However, thank you for your patience, Dorothy. I'll just introduce you now. Dorothy Chan is Head of Philanthropy Services and Advisory Asia Pacific, responsible for leading HSBC Global Private Banking's philanthropy advisory services in the region. Dorothy has over 20 years of experience in the sustainable development field, spanning private, public, non-profit sectors. And before joining HSBC, Dorothy was Secretary of the Board Level Corporate Responsibility Committee and Senior Manager corporate responsible at NTR Corporation. And I could go on because there is lots to say, but Dorothy, I'd like you to take the floor now. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Elaine. And I have to say that it is very humbling to be on the same panel with Bruce and Hafsat, and many of the things they shared, especially with Hafsat sharing. I found there's so much commonality with our thinking and mindset in Asia. And I have to thank Bruce for setting up the framework on how we should be thinking about common good. This is probably one of the most challenging topics to cover or even conduct a sharing. And it required a lot of reflection, and I think it's also very timely to have this discourse, as Bruce mentioned. For me, the common good could happen at the village, at the city, at the national, or even international levels. And each of them is a little brick that builds on each other to achieve a much larger picture. So I think for the next few minutes, I'll be happy to share some observation from Asia. And I do have to apologize in advance that I would not be as articulate as Bruce or Hafsat, because they've obviously been spending a lot more time thinking about these topics and have wonderful experience to share with all of you. So I was also asked when we were planning for the webinar whether common good is a Western concept. And my immediate response then was, of course, it's not a Western concept. In Asia, we highly value harmony and social cohesion. And that is sort of the invisible hand that is shaping the sense of common good. But as you know, the webinar comes near, I was thinking more about it. I realized that we don't have the exact term in Chinese language, which I know better. And in mainland China, many private foundations will use the term 公益 or public welfare in their name to reflect their founders' intention to improve the well-being and development of the wider community. And beyond public welfare, the closest word that can express the concept of common good is 共同利益, which technically translates to mutual benefit. And when I think of mutual benefit, for me, it sort of implies there is some give and take or some compromises. And it is with that context I think that's make Asian giving unique. And so I'll spend the next few minutes covering what is giving in Asia and what are some of the trends that gives me hope that we'll be able to achieve some sort of consensus when it comes to achieving common good in whatever way that we defined it. But first, I have to say I'll be remiss if I do not highlight that Asia covers over 30 countries with different cultures, all in different stages of economic and social development. So I'll be generalizing quite a bit, and my sharing will probably be leaning more about the North Asia experience, which is where I work with clients a lot more. But I think it is still fair to state that a number of the wealth owners in the region still sees and still recall the challenging conditions that they experienced as they built their wealth. And these memories and life experiences influences what they give to and how they give. And in my conversations with our clients who are big philanthropists, many of them shares that their personal success is only possible because the wider community welcomed them or played a role in their wealth building journey. In fact, one of them has publicly stated that he gives because, in quotation, what is taken from the community should be given back to the community, end quote. This kind of harmony and social cohesion mindset as a result influence how they work or how they give. And it could be categorized as a concentric circle. You first take care of your family members, then your villages and cities, and then your affiliates such as schools or religious institution, and finally society at large. And for many years, this kind of concentric circle giving has worked, and it led to the establishment of many social service institutions that governments depend on to complement or augment the provision of public services. For instance, here in Hong Kong, 173 years ago, a group of Chinese community leaders founded the Tonghua Group of Hospitals to provide free medicine to the poor in response to the many sick people congregating near a particular temple and potentially posing a health and hygiene challenge for that area. I highlight this as samples because this group of businessmen who formed the group of hospitals were mediators between the local Chinese and the colonial government back then. They went about to secure the government's blessing, raise funds, and they built the first hospital serving the Chinese community. The organization is still thriving today and continues to play a pivotal role in providing education, healthcare, and other social services in the community. But I think what they did is unique about Asia is that openness to partner or coordinate with government when it comes to giving. It comes at no surprise. I think it's pretty universal. A lot of philanthropists are business owners themselves. And in fact, here in Asia, an estimated 80% of businesses are owned by families. And they tend to have the view that the philanthropic dollars or their resources are very tiny when it comes to government spending. And as Hafez just mentioned, they realize that they have limited ability to bring about change if they were going to do it alone. So their next best thing to do is to work with government and align their giving with the government's development priorities. And let the government define what is the common good. So how does this partnership or coordination play out across Asia? You may be wondering. So in Singapore, the government created a matchmaking platform called Coaxis, where donors can learn about and also put in funding to a bunch of pre-screened projects that match their own area of an interest. In other parts of the region, it's less formalized. Donors will seek guidance from government. It could be both local government in the provincial areas or at the national government level. And learn about what are the areas of greatest needs, what are the government priorities, and who are the social service partner that they could work with to help improve lives and and uplift communities. Now, I do have to concede that this model is not perfect, and that much of the giving done this way has been more charitable in nature. But we're also starting to see a shift into the deep philanthropy that is needed to achieve systemic change. More and more wealth owners are embracing the concept of philanthropy as society's risk capital. We are seeing private foundations taking the lead in identifying opportunity areas, piloting solutions with stakeholders, and working with governments to scale proven solutions or introduce new policies to support the change. For instance, the Lee Hyson Foundation in Hong Kong initiated a study on elder abuse after it found out that not only is there no elder abuse related legislation, but most interventions are remedial in nature, and that there is significant evidence of serious underreporting of cases. The foundation has been partnering with subject experts from 5 disciplines such as nursing, rehab sciences, and social sciences, and also a number of NGOs to pilot and test a comprehensive set of protocol to detect, intervene, and prevent elder abuse, with the view of helping the government develop policy and develop their service. And the Hong Kong government has been quite receptive to this type of public-private collaboration. In fact, it adopted recommendations that a funders network that is focused on aging well presented to them, and that gives philanthropists, especially private individuals, confidence that they're able to play a role to delve deep into an issue, gather data and evidence, and present their solutions to government so that it could scale. So this model, as I mentioned, is not perfect because the public sector has to maximize their return on every dollar spent in a community. But at least we are helping to address the needs of a number of the mass. And this, when we still have some ways to go in terms of catering to the aspiration and needs of all different segments of the community. But I think philanthropy itself is dynamic, and the region is also evolving. So the model that we talked about earlier about affiliation and community-based giving continues to take place. But as wealth increases across Asia, we're seeing greater interest in directing resources towards cross-border or transnational issue. In Southeast Asia, where the effects of a changing climate are felt more prominently, there's a lot more interest and actually not more than interest, there's a lot more philanthropists who are actually funding environmental preservation or sustainability education programs outside their home countries to strengthen climate resilience. The thinking behind it is preventing forest fires results in cleaner air for countries that share the same airshed. Protecting watershed upstreams enable everybody who share the Mekong River Delta access to clean water. And I think that's a positive development because it reflects a more expansive interpretation of the sense of common good. And we're also seeing greater interest in collecting giving as a result. Some of the intermediaries in Asia, such as the Asia Philanthropy Network, shares that uptick has been positive in the pool funds that they've created to address transnational issues such as sustainability and female empowerment. And another part that I felt is quite exciting is the general democratization of giving. 10 Cent 99 Charity Day every year raises around $500 million from over 150 million people. And it just shows the desire and the active participation of the everyday citizens wishing to help others who are less fortunate or have fewer resources, both financially and also through volunteering their skills and knowledges. And I think in general, I think philanthropy is still viewed positively in Asia. And where there's criticism is mostly around whether resources are deployed effectively or whether we can accelerate the pace of giving. And to that end, I am quite optimistic because the younger wealth owners are taking steps beyond grant making to deliver change. They're experimenting with approaches such as pay for success, blended finance funding model, or investing in startups or B Corps to tackle root cause and use multiple approach to bring about more structural change. And as the great wealth transfer takes place over the next decade, I think we will see more innovative approach and more activities tackling issues such as climate change, water security, or food security that impacts all living beings on Earth. And some of the work that philanthropists are doing today, although they might not necessarily be as forward thinking as we would like it to be, will still pay off as they're empowering more community level individuals to deliver on needs in the community and also help us achieve the common good. So with that, I will pass the time back to you, Elaine.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I have to say that was very eloquent. So don't worry about that at all. I can't believe how far into our time we have run. So I'm going to jump straight into the audience Q&A, and I'm going to ask, in the interest of covering as many questions as we can, you keep your responses brief. First, I'm going to go to Stefan. And this I'm going to pose to all three of you. He says, Asked One once made the quote, "The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it." What is your view on that? What is your view on that, especially in relation to economic activities and the issue of pricing, externalities into cost of products and services that requires regulation? Quite a lengthy question. Let me know if you want me to repeat it, but I'm going to come to you first, Bruce.
My immediate reaction is I totally agree with the quote, and in fact, I think what that relates to is the sense of personal responsibility for social problems. That is, there should be that emphasis added throughout philanthropy or throughout all the work we do that encourages people to think much about their own role in social responsibility. So I would simply agree with the quote and with the intent behind it.
Great, thank you, Bruce. And Dorothy and Hafsat, what is your view on this quote, especially coming from non-Western backgrounds? Hafsat, we'll go to you first.
So I just would like to use that as an opportunity to talk about how I became involved with the climate crisis. You know, one of the people in my circle that I've been privileged to have as a mentor, a role model is Mary Robinson. And I'm part of a group called Connected Women Leaders. I'm one of the co-leads of Connected Women Leaders that was created by Pat Mitchell, a woman that was president of PBS for over 12 years, and also by Rhonda Carnegie, who was one of the initiators of TED Women. And it's essentially a community of women who believe in the power of women and believe that when women come together, action follows on behalf of the planet. And when we convened one year in Italy, Mama Mary came to us and she said, because when she was Undersecretary for the UN Commission on Human Rights, she used to go to the Caribbean where there'll be a flood, there'll be some kind of, natural crisis, or not natural, because later they found that these crises were being propelled by the climate crisis because of the change in the climate. And so she realized from going to all the COP events that even if we were to implement the COP agreements 100%, we were not in line to stay within 2 degrees temperature increase, which is what the scientists tell us will push humanity into unknown territory. And I think at that moment, Mama Mary realized that if we're going to solve this, we have to solve it. We can't say the leaders are going to solve it, the scientists are going to solve it. All of humanity has to take responsibility for it. So she challenged the women in Connected Women Leaders to take it on as our central issue. And since then, we've been working on this. and we have a campaign called Project Dandelion, where we're trying to mobilize 2 billion people around the world. And actually, there was a Yale study that showed that there are 2 billion people around the world who are really alarmed about climate, but don't know what to do. So there are those people. We have to reach them, help them see what we can do all together, because I believe that if we can mobilize the 2 billion people, we will get more action, more commitment, more implementation around climate. The truth is, and I realized this when my father ran for office, in Nigeria, we can always wait for somebody to come to make the change. But if we are aware of a problem, that suggests that maybe that person is us, because sometimes other people are not even aware. So we that are aware should see that as a sign that this is our work to do. And the good thing, going back to the African saying that we go together, the good thing is we don't have to do this alone. We can reach out to others and figure out how to work with others, through others, to get the momentum going, to get to the change we need.
Thank you, Hafsat. That's a really really interesting response to the quote. I'm just moving on quickly because I am so conscious of time, and I would like Dorothy to have the opportunity to respond as well, and perhaps we'll have some time to fit in another question as well. Please go ahead, Dorothy.
Thank you, Elaine. And thank you for this great question. To that end, I have two responses. On the one hand, in terms of internalizing the cost and the production, I probably a bit rosy view in this sense, because I have been very fortunate working with a number of companies that have a very solid decarbonization plan, and that goes beyond just improving our own operations. The companies I work for also felt that it's their responsibility to work with not only suppliers, but also make it easy for their customers to take action. So one of the things that I would say they did was for a power company that I used to work with, we introduced a platform that helped people see how much they're using electricity and the carbon being emitted versus their neighbors, and it offer incentives for them to reduce their own electricity consumption, and there are reminders telling them to switch electricity off. And I've also been into discussion, even something as small as how do you design a recycling bin so that people will use it properly and it's more prominent. So because I've been involved in these kind of conversations, I feel that the corporate sector is taking this seriously, and change takes time. And this also leads to the first statement, why it's somebody else's job, right? Because I've also have come across clients who are private individuals who have been supporting climate-related solutions for over a decade, and they are coming towards a different phase in their life. They're questioning whether the impact of the given has been achieved, since no progress has also been made. So for them, they might say something. I feel like they're more heartbroken when they say that I'll leave it to others because it's not my problem to solve anymore. At those times, I usually just have to encourage them. If you give up, others will give up too. Just let's continue to soldier on. I think every single drop matters. Similar to what Hafsat mentioned earlier, right? You have a vessel, if it's leaking, we will try to plug the hole. If you and I don't try within our own remit, or what we can do to influence ourselves, people around others, we will never be able to solve the climate challenge. So I hope that addressed the question.
Yes, thank you, Dorothy. Unfortunately, I think we only have time for one more question, but it is related to what you just spoke about, Dorothy. So perhaps you can take the lead and then pass on to Bruce or Hafsat. We have a question from our audience member that says, to resolve systemic problems like climate, how can philanthropy, traditionally siloed to specific causes, mandate, or region, to work together and systematically? And think about this in terms of the common good, as the climate crisis is a global issue.
I think there are many layers or activities that I feel like it's happening. Is that we're no longer looking at climate as a standalone. We're seeing the health impacts of climate change, and increasingly when I speak with researchers or solutions providers, they're making the linkage between the two. Same for water security, how climate change is affecting water, food, and health. And because we're able to shape the discussion within our donors' interest. For instance, my donor is interested in health, and we're able to articulate if they support in helping to eliminate the use of coal burning stoves in a certain community. What are the health impacts for the community members? They are more receptive to it. So part of it is the reframing that is happening and the appreciation about the interconnectedness of different issues. So I feel like we are making progress, but it takes time and education. But I would encourage everybody to stay optimistic. Just even Jane Goodall, she wrote the Book of Hope precisely because we don't hear enough about the actions that are taking place, the minor changes that is taking place, and we give up too soon.
Great. Thank you, Dorothy. And Bruce, if I could ask you to come in on the same question, let me know if you need me to repeat it.
I think I've got it. I would say that it's one of the challenges of philanthropy itself is that it tends to be come out of a kind of individualistic background, and so that flavors the field. Even though I think contemporary attempts to kind of overcome that are important. That's why I think the common good theme is so important, because it has to do with something broader than just particular individual problems, but it has to do with changing fundamental attitude toward solving problems fundamentally related to attitudinal change as a whole, as opposed to specific problem-solving projects. So I think addressing the fundamental issue in philanthropy is as important as anything in trying to address that question.
Thank you, Bruce. And Hafsat, I'm treating this question as our closing remarks because I'm aware that we have run over. So please, Hafsat, please take the floor.
And I'll be as brief as possible. I think what I'd like to say about this issue of climate and the common good is that climate is such a challenging issue because the way in which companies, the biggest companies in the world, have been making money and the things they've been able to get away with in the pursuit of profit, they can no longer continue to do if we're to live in a sane and healthy, ecologically healthy planet. But to make that transition is going to be difficult. Many companies are pretty much stronger than most governments. I mean, they even have much more money than much of the world's governments. And so how to control the companies? I think that what I find interesting about climate is that the biggest people, the group that suffers the most from climate impacts are women and girls. It's been well documented. When we talk about poverty, when we talk about sustainable development, it's very clear that we need to bring women and girls into the center of the solutions. But when we talk about climate, if you talk to the major philanthropy, major foundations, they talk about technological solutions. They're not talking about centering women and girls or centering indigenous solutions or centering solutions that women and girls pioneer, because women and girls are not just victims. They also have solutions that they can put forward. But we're not part of that. We're so marginal to that conversation. And I think that has to change if we want to make progress on this issue. We'll need to tackle, I'm told that there's just a couple dozen companies that account for about 80% of the pollution. We're going to have to mobilize the world's people so that those companies get a sense of pressure to make the changes that they need to make. And we're going to need to begin to center women and girls, scientists, indigenous leaders, community activists. I was just looking at what's going on in France, where the climate activists are being criminalized by their government, by their police. They're being beaten, they're being intimidated because they're trying to raise awareness that this Olympic Games, as wonderful as it is, could have probably been done in a more ecological way. We keep criminalizing the environmental activists, and we're making them bear the burden of the climate crisis. They are not the criminals. Our economic system that we've tolerated to create incredible wealth that goes to a very small group of people is the criminal in this story. And I'm sorry to say, we're going to have to change that. It's not to criminalize anybody. It's not to make anyone feel bad. It's just that we have children, we have grandchildren. They deserve to live in a healthy planet. And they're not going to have that opportunity unless we all rise up together and make the changes that we need to make. And women, grandmothers, mothers, children, daughters can carry this burden with men so that we can have a world that works for all of us. Philanthropy can get behind them or maybe get out of the way.
Great. Thank you, Hafsat. That's a great closing remark as well. I am so sorry to some of the audience members who asked questions who we haven't been able to get to, but I would like to thank all of our panelists for some brilliant insights and some great presentations. I'm going to give our closing remarks now for Alliance. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. If you found it helpful, engaging, don't forget to use the link in the chat to take advantage of the 20% discount. It's event 24. Subscribing to Alliance also ensures that you will always benefit from free access to our events. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again to Bruce, Dorothy and Hafsat for a wonderful session today. And good afternoon or have a good day wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much.